Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Please take a minute, invite folks into the discussion. Good afternoon, where I am, good time zone, wherever you are in the world. It's good to be with you all. I'm extremely excited about this conversation, mainly because, obviously we've been doing a lot of different discussions around Palestine for the last, you know, 11 months, right, amid this genocide and the resistance to it. And one of the organizations that I have not been able to engage as much as I would like to, in part because they're extremely busy organizing all the time, and also because um, I just haven't had the opportunity to reach out on certain specific things. We did do the conversation around all the way back with the Black Friday discussion with them, shutting down Black Friday all the way back in November, right? That's how crazy things are. So, very excited to have two folks from the Palestinian Youth Movement today, Kaleem Hawa and Jeanine Hourani. I hope I didn't mispronounce either of their names. They can correct me when they come on. So Kaleem wrote a piece that I think a lot of folks will be familiar with or saw that started to make the rounds probably 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago now. It's called "Like a Bag Trying to Empty," which is about Palestinian martyr Walid Daqqa. And so I reached out to Kaleem, wanted to have a conversation. Kaleem brought on his comrade Jeanine, and the three of us are going to talk about that piece. So I'm going to invite them to the stage now, and we can get right into it. Kaleem and Jeanine, welcome to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
It's great to be with you both. So first of all, just welcome. It's truly an honor to host you both for this conversation. I wanted to take a minute, just thank you both for all the work that you're doing as organizers with the Palestinian Youth Movement. Shout out to your organization. Obviously, everybody knows PYM by now, or certainly should, but as one of the leading organizations of the Palestinian Youth Movement, in different countries in the United States, I know, in particular, but Jeanine, I think you're in the UK, is that correct? Yeah, and so other places around the world as well. And so just start, talk a little bit, I know you all have been, as I said, extremely busy for the last 11 months, doing all kinds of different organizing projects, but just introduce yourselves a little bit and say a little bit about your organization, as well as we were going to talk about this at the end, but I think we should sort of give an opportunity to plug it up front, like any campaigns or upcoming organizing that you all want to point out.
Thank you. It's really great to be on. We're both big fans of the podcast and have watched a lot of the episodes and sent them around as political education throughout the organization and with other comrades. I'll start just very quickly to talk a little bit about the Palestinian Youth Movement and the moment we're in. We are a political organization of Arab and Palestinian youth who are see ourselves as part of the historic and ongoing national liberation struggle in Palestine, fighting for the total liberation of our homeland and eventual return. And as you mentioned, we have chapters in Canada, Britain, Italy, and the United States. And we're engaged in a project of struggle, which includes mobilization and political education, and essentially trying to beg the question of Palestine, connect with a broader left forces in the movement, and we're mobilizing and organizing against the ongoing genocide. Obviously, in this moment, there have been a lot of notable developments since October, with a very high level of politicization in the public on the question of Palestine, something I think many of us could not have foreseen and is largely a testament to the struggle on the ground in occupied Palestine. And we've seen lots of new organizations emerge and build infrastructure for the struggle in communications and outreach and confrontation, each with their own theory of accumulation. And I think that's the main point that I wanted to bring up in the intro to PYM, is that the visible work is only a small portion of what we do in the far diaspora, and laying the groundwork for people to continue that struggle is really one of the most foundational principles for us as an organization.
Yeah. And I think like concretely as well, like something that we've been thinking about a lot in this historic moment that we're in is, how do we meet this historic moment? Like this is once in a lifetime or once in a struggle moment that we're experiencing, and how do we harness the moment into kind of building long-term sustainable power for change. And so in May of this year, the PYM, along with a coalition of other organizations, hosted the People's Conference for Palestine, which was a historic conference and part of like the long tradition and legacy of conferences, of bringing people together as part of kind of like the third world internationalist tradition of strategizing and consolidating relationships and strategy for like the next phase of our struggle. And also at the People's Conference, we launched the Mask Off Merce campaign, which is PYM's first campaign officially that we've launched. And it's a transnational campaign against logistics giant Maersk, which is involved in transportation of weapons components to the US for assembly from all over the world. And then also through a partnership with the Department of Defense, the US Department of Defense, involved in transporting weapons from the US to the Zionist entity of Israel. And so those are kind of two examples of ways that we've tried to kind of harness the power of this moment into more sustainable and like long-term ways for engagement and for political consolidation. And obviously, we're also coming up to marking 1 year of genocide and over 100 years of struggle and of resistance. And so, on October 5th, PYM has called for an International Day of Action. So, just to plug that, to check out our socials and find a mobilization near you, and get involved if you haven't already.
Thank you so much for that. So let's move into this beautiful essay, and I just want to say, Kaleem, that it's just a beautiful piece of writing. It's extensive. It's a long piece, but really well written, and I think I just want to thank you for writing it. I know that one of my friends in an organization has already turned it into a zine along with some of Walid Daqqa's writings to send into prisoners inside. So it's already connecting a lot of people to Walid Daqqa's work. And so you start this piece talking about El Magdal, or correct my pronunciation because I don't know.
El Majdal.
Majdal. Okay. Describing the process of ethnic cleansing and then settler colonialism to which the town and its inhabitants were subjected. I'm going to quote a bit of it to start us off. So slowly, this is from the piece, slowly the town became the garrison and the prison became the engine of the land's transformation. A small prison overlooking the larger one, which is to say Gaza, where the land's inhabitants were deposited. Today, just a few blocks from the town center in Gaza's Bet Lahia, there is a El Majdal street following the practice of residents naming neighborhood spots to mark their future return. All across Palestine, the prisons spread as monuments to Zionism, way stations for the wretched uprooted on the march to an Arab-free state, end quote. So can you talk a little bit about the dynamics that you're laying out in the beginning of the piece? You're both welcome to remark on this, of course. Thinking about ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, forced displacement, and the establishment of garrisons and prisons, right, which are a central, institutions or architecture of this process. So these are important relationships, which I think are not often linked in everyone's analysis. I'd love if we just start there.
Yeah, I mean, you basically said it. This section opens the piece. It's on Al-Majdal, which is in the south of Palestine. The colonial name it is now given is Ashkelon. And Al-Majdal was depopulated during the Nakba and the operations in the south of Palestine across sort of two distinct periods of dispossession. And the sort of the reason why the essay starts with Al-Majdal is to sort of use it as a launching point to understand the stories of dispossession and population management and resistance that are geographically specific and occur in and around each of these sites during the Nakba. And so, in a way, there's a prison that was constructed, a police station first that was constructed in Al-Majdal, eventually is transformed into a prison by the Zionist colonial authorities. The police station that was constructed was by the British. And through a focus on this prison, Ashkelon prison, both as a brick and mortar site, but also as part of a process mediating the theft of land and the movement of people, we are granted a vantage point. It allows you to see the engine, as you mentioned, of settler colonialism and to trace its connections between the British mandate and the ongoing Zionist settler colonial project, and which Jeanine will have a lot to say about those connections from her research. So from Al-Majdal's the early experiences of the Nakba for the residents of Al-Majdal, we can then understand and follow how this space and geography transformed over time, and how it became a settler garrison that hovers over many of the land's original inhabitants now displaced to Gaza, and how they return to it and it returns to them throughout history. And we will see some of the resistance figures that emerged from or whose families were dispossessed from Al-Majdal later on in the essay. For Walid Daqqa specifically, one of our political prisoners, now martyrs, and a writer and an intellectual of the Palestinian struggle, Ashkelon prison in Al-Majdal figures quite prominently, but you'll notice he doesn't appear at all in the first section of the essay. Ashkelon will eventually play a central role in his story. It's, for example, the location of his wedding to Sanat, his wife, and I think that's the sort of core of why we start there. I think the second part that's important about the story of Al-Majdal and about this section is to introduce one of the frameworks for analysis that the essay adopts, which has been the subject of research by a Palestinian scholar, Samar al-Saleh, who writes about the specific function of the prison across time and space, not just using the Nakba as its starting point, but preceding the Nakba. And one of her interventions is to say that the prisons are both sites for the disorganization of Palestinian resistance, essentially to fight and dismember the Palestinian struggle, but also sites of labor exploitation for colonial development. And so each section of the essay then is in conversation with different Palestinian scholars like Lena Mirri, Ismail al-Nashif, Samar, and then most of all, Abdurrahim al-Sheikh, who is a longtime comrade of Daqqa's and a friend to his family and a historian of Daqqa's work. And so this first section helps us understand that from the start, prisons have always produced resistance, both by the prisoners within it and by the struggle around it. And in Samar's research, for instance, She uses Tulkarm and Nur Shams as examples as sites of struggle during the 36 to 39 Great Revolts, and traces how that history sort of continues into the present day with Tulkarm and Nur Shams as very important sites of resistance that have been faced by the ongoing siege in the West Bank this past week. So I think I'll leave it there, but I will just say that kind of the purpose of this opening section is to repropose the prison as an important analytic for Palestine. And this has obviously been, it's nothing new, it's been said by many thinkers, but it is often omitted in English language writing about Palestine. And so that's the way it opens.
Yeah, I think what's really beautiful about Kaleem's piece as well is how kind of like the story of Walid Daqqa tells the story of Palestinian prisoners and of Palestine, and how the story of Palestine and Palestinian prisoners is the story of Walid Daqqa. Like the two are seen as so intertwined with each other. And I think, that is so fitting because prisoners have always been at the forefront of the Palestinian struggle and of resistance to Zionism and imperialism. And, in the Palestine movement, we often refer to prisoners as the compass of our struggle. And so it makes sense that the way that we orient towards our analysis of Palestine and of of our struggle, kind of the North Star is the prisoner's struggle. And actually, kind of as Kaleem mentions, and as Samar kind of researches, the Palestinian prisoner centrality to the struggle, goes long before 1948. And I think for me, situated here in London, it's kind of important to touch on the role that the British played in kind of stifling Palestinian resistance even before the Zionist entity of Israel was established. So, for example, in 1930, the British police executed 3 resistance fighters in Akka prison, and there's a song from Akka prison that is kind of immortalized generation after generation that speaks to the story of these 3 prisoners. And also during the British Mandate, which lasted from 1920 till 1948, and especially, as kind of Kaleem mentioned, between 1936 and 1939, during the Great Arab Revolt, imprisonment was a regular experience, and the British regularly incarcerated Palestinians, especially those who were resisting, and in that process built an entire prison infrastructure that is still kind of adopted to this day in the Zionist entity. And there was kind of this transfer of tools, from the peripheries back to the imperial core, and from the imperial core out into the peripheries. And so we can really see how the tools of imprisonment and incarceration and policing that we see in Palestine today both were created by the British, and there's a British legacy to them, but also how those also impacted policing and incarceration in places like Britain today. And there are things like, for example, collective punishment. That's something that we still see the Zionist regime using against Palestinians today, which was actually first introduced by the British during the Great Arab Revolt, or administrative detention, which is when prisoners are detained without charge or trial. That was also introduced by the British during the Mandate period. So we still see a lot of the legacy and the pre-Nakba legacy of the prisoner struggle playing out today across historic Palestine and even in the diaspora.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think this is exactly what Jeanine said, why it's so essential to keep the pre-Nakba period in mind is that I think it allows us to respond to a lot of liberal narrations of the Palestinian struggle that want to, essentially exceptionalize and victimize Palestinians. So many of the structures of oppression and violence that predate the Nakba occur, at least in the Palestinian intellectual tradition, across different sites of struggle, you could say, and they're usually described as being the city, the village or field, and the prison. and they are, interconnected distillation sites of the Palestinian story. And if you think about each, you can have a particular liberal reading of those sites of struggle if you do not situate Palestine within a larger imperial project. So you would see, you would narrate the city as a site of cosmopolitanism. You would narrate the field as this sort of romantic topography that Palestinians long for. And you would narrate the prison as this place full of stoic, suffering people. And essentially, this analysis of imperialism allows for a more accurate response in each of these sites to understand the urban spaces as places for segregation and surveillance, and where the current nationalist bourgeoisie resides, and then going outwards to the village as a place of water and land politics and the self-defense of the Palestinian people, and then in the prison itself, not as necessarily as victims, but as a site of political formation and cultural production and networks of resistance.
Thank you for all of that. Yeah, I mean, it also brings to mind too that for like so much of the world, that, and including in the United States, this settler legacy, that prisons are a product of colonialism, right? It's not, most countries, it's a product of that process. So let me pull up. So another thing I wanted to talk about was, talking about Daqqa's work a little bit. You draw upon a point of his on the shift he diagnoses from prisoners as places seeking to control Palestinian bodies to a place seeking to control Palestinian minds, something that he also links to the rise of more advanced carceral technologies. This is, of course, happened as a kind of dialectical response to the ingenuity and resilience of the Palestinian prisoners movement. This also reminded me a lot of Orasami Burton's work in Tip of the Spear in the U.S. context post-Attica, where he examines actually exactly the same kind of shift. So could you share a little bit about this?
I mean, do you want me to go, Kaleem? Yeah, I think to speak to this question, I'll hand over to Kaleem in a second. I think to speak to this question, it's really important to kind of like contextualize kind of how Palestinian resistance is kind of policed and how it is punished through through imprisonment. We know that the more Palestinians resist, the stronger the policing and incarceration they experience. Like the stronger the incarceration and policing they experience. And this is because, as we kind of spoke about just before, incarceration is a Zionist strategy to kind of isolate Palestinian freedom fighters and dissidents from the rest of the Palestinian society. So there's a lot of fragmentation that the prison system and imprisonment tries to enforce on the Palestinian people, whether it's separation of the mind and the body, or separation of the resistance fighter from the masses or from the street, and broadly an attempt to crush Palestinian resistance. And this is why our leaders are targeted by the Zionist carceral system. And we can kind of, I spoke to administrative detention just before. We can look to administrative detention as one example to kind of see how these fluctuations in imprisonment happen, because the frequency and the use of administrative detention has actually fluctuated throughout the Zionist entity's colonial project and has been steadily rising since the outbreak of the Second Intifada. But also we see kind of bursts of administrative detention being used following the 2014 war on Gaza, after October 2015, and after October 7th, 2024. And so we can kind of like map these tools and how the Palestinians are resisting and the intensity of their confrontation with the enemy. And we can see how these tools are kind of exacerbated and employed in more intense or frequent ways in moments of heightened resistance, and how this is kind of proof, I guess, of the way that imprisonment is used to kind of stifle Palestinian resistance, to punish our leaders during moments of heightened confrontation, as an attempt to kind of stifle that confrontation and quell resistance. And so just to provide some kind of like context behind your question, Jared.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, as Jeanine said, there's transformations in the nature of imprisonment that Daqqa is diagnosing and is writing. One of the studies that is most widely known is his Searing Consciousness on the redefining of torture. And so from using that as a launching off point, we can understand some of these qualitative changes in imprisonment and what they've meant for the struggle. So Daqqa talks about a more mechanized control in the prison, less of ability of the prisoners to negotiate or have human elements, quote unquote, with their jailers, and therefore this impersonality and almost sterile quality to the prison that gets, quote unquote, quieter. He also talks about how sociality is attacked, less family visitations, more encouragement and support for the individual comforts of leisure or sport to try to change and to essentially amend the connection to existing networks of support and social formation. And the goal here is to push the Palestinian prisoner away from a revolutionary sociality. Basically, the idea that you can't kill Palestinians only by killing and maiming them, but also by killing the idea of Palestine within them and creating incentives for them to acquiesce. And so I think what Daqqa is doing here is trying to counter sort of the mystification of how prison operates by being very specific about the conditions. And what he's suggesting, which I think runs through his entire study, and when he talks about this idea of like molding a consciousness or searing it so that it can be molded and changed. I would argue that what he's doing is suggesting that the prisoner is being reified under the current conditions, so that they're not just alienated, but actually in their struggle, as part of their struggle for recognition, the colonial project responds by trying to transform their human relations, their actions as prisoners, into almost a man-made thing, to turn the Palestinian under captivity into a prisoner object. For the Zionists, they can then take that object and mold it as part of their project. But on the flip side, for those who claim to be in solidarity with the prisoner, that object can be fetishized or extracted from by elements of the liberation struggle. And so I think what Daqqa is trying to do here is show that the prisons have evolved to reduce, sort of as much as possible, the like tactile interface between the prisoner and their jailer. And this is sort of similar to an essay that was recently published by Nasser Abdurrahman in Radical Philosophy, where he talks about colonial domination as a way of essentially refusing to, like, trying to impose itself without having to come into contact with the prisoner, like a personalization of violence. And so what Daqqa is suggesting through this is that there are different ways to resist. They don't necessarily always have to be direct confrontation with the jailer or physical violence, but that there can be a slow accumulation of knowledge, that there can be refusal, like a rejection of the terms of the prison wholesale, and that those also constitute a form of resistance that help to strengthen the Palestinian mind and protect, essentially provide protective qualities to them under those conditions.
That's great. Thank you. So another dynamic that Daqqa illustrates is that you discuss is how strategies of counterinsurgency in the prisons mirrored the counterinsurgency strategies used in the post-Oslo period. As you write, quote, U.S. Security Coordinator for the Israel-Palestinian Authority, Lieutenant General Keith Dayton, described the development of post-Oslo security sector coordination with the Palestinian Authority as a process of generating what he deemed, quote, new men of Palestine, end quote. So maybe we could talk a little bit. I know we had another question that we're going to probably jump over just for time on the first intifada, but this might be a time when we could talk about a little bit of that as well, of this period of, you have the first intifada and you have Oslo and you have the post-Oslo moment, which specifically is what Daqqa is referring to here. But there's a kind of, a give and take again, I'm sure, that you would want to highlight between kind of the insurgency and the counterinsurgency strategies in that period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think basically the section on counterinsurgency that you're asking about is it suggests that there is this like valence of forces between the prison and outside the prison that is constantly in a process of being refined, expanded when it needs to be, accelerated and more physically violent when it needs to be, as we saw after Al-Aqsa flood, and basically that this like adaptiveness is changing alongside the changing conditions of the resistance struggle, both inside and outside prisons. And so the post-Oslo period, which Daqqa is writes a lot about, he is essentially suggesting that at the aggregate level, the tactics that are being used within the prison are being refined and then brought outside of the prison, and vice versa, and that essentially the overall sort of the overall objective is politicized, one could say, and counterinsurgency is one tool that it's the tactical framework, holistic tactical framework that is being used. And so if you think of Palestinians as having been geographically isolated by successive rounds of dispossession from pre-Nakba onwards, you, as Jeanine said early on on the show, that each of these sites ends up receiving its own strategy in order to counter the struggle, and that this is a holistic strategy. So you can use debt and displacement, in particular, let's say in the West Bank, and you can use dismemberment and death in Gaza, demoralization maybe in the far diaspora. Like, all of these strategies exist in all places, but how significant they are adapts to what is required of it in that moment. And so Zionists are learning to understand the totality of how Palestinians resist and attempt to attack that, to isolate the prisoner and all Palestinians from a national consciousness, to make bodies essentially out of a Palestinian national collective.
Yeah, I think Kaleem's raising like a really important point around how how Daqqa talks about how two things. The first one is how kind of like prisons and the prison system is used to individualize and atomize Palestinians and kind of reduce us to individuals. And, Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich talks about this. He talks about, if Palestinians want to stay on the land, they have to live as individuals. This idea that we can't live collectively, we have to live as individuals, and kind of the psychological impacts or the psychological attempts to atomize us into individuals and kind of fragment us as a people. This like geographical fragmentation that Kaleem is talking about, but that actually, despite these attempts to isolate Palestinian prisoners and to isolate Palestinians from each other, actually, not only, like, I think it's also important to extend this idea that the Israeli regime or the Zionist regime is transporting lessons from the prison to outside of the prison, but actually we as Palestinians are also transporting lessons from our prisoners to the Palestinian street as well. And so our resistance tactics, our the way that we relate to the Palestinian struggle is also innovated based on our orientation towards prisoners kind of as the compass of our struggle. And, you know, during times of division on the Palestinian street, it's often actually the Palestinian prisoners movement that has always reminded the street of the importance of unity, and that unity is the only answer to Zionist imposed kind of political and geographical fragmentation. And, you know, the prisoners movement in these times of division has come out demanding that, you know, the unity of the prisons be reflected be reflected in the street. And one of the ways we see this kind of unity playing out in the prison system or in Israeli prisons is that when a Palestinian cadre is interred, they immediately enter this like new, you know, socio-political organism of the prison, and seniority in the prisoners movement reflects you know, it reflects, you know, revolutionary experience and revolutionary potential of the cadre that's interred, regardless of what faction they belong to. And so this is one example of how the prisoners movement displays unity in a way that we on the outside and on the streets have a lot to learn from. And one of the ways that, you know, we're seeing this unity play out today is in the unity of the fields approach. This is an approach that came out of May 2021, but we have kind of seen it play out in practice after October 7th, you know, with different Palestinian factions coming together and conducting joint operations, with Palestinians uniting across different geographies. Especially now we're seeing you know, a series of resistance operations in the West Bank that's kind of reigniting the Palestinian street. And so these lessons of unity, whether it's geographical or whether it's kind of political ideological, are things that we learn from Palestinian prisoners and that we can apply to the way that we're organizing in the diaspora as well.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Jared, I just wanted to add, because I realized your question was also about the first Intifada and stuff, and maybe to make it a little bit more real for people listening. And I think most of your listeners are familiar with the concept of counterinsurgency. But basically, during the first Intifada, where you have a huge, essentially, uprising across many of the different popular fronts of the struggle. So it's not when we talk about this counterinsurgency program, it's not specifically against armed resistance, but like a collective social and political resistance. So you have, you know, unions and the educators, agricultural workers, youth, and the elders, all contributing to the struggle in this first Intifada moment. And so suddenly the Zionist project realizes, well, let's not say suddenly, but like they sort of understand the importance of holistically responding to all elements of Palestinian society that resist, both, like, not just through armed resistance, but through all types. And so how you target self-sustenance through agriculture, education, and the building of popular organizations more broadly is also part of this picture, in addition to the prisons.
Thank you. Yeah, and that comment you made, Jeanine, about the individual, you know, and Smotrich around that. I mean, I'm just sitting here thinking about that, you know, that, yeah. As somebody said in the chat, that's barbaric. Just so I obviously solitary confinement is an important you know, kind of aspect of the Palestinian prisoner struggle. It's, you know, important in the writing of Walid Daqqa, and this is also a part of this discussion of shifting from you know, sort of what was the phrase, but basically, you know, targeting consciousness, right, in many ways, right, because people who haven't spent a lot of time talking to people with solitary confinement, you know, hopefully people haven't experienced it, although probably some in the chat have. You know, more than anything, it's a process of kind of psychological warfare, torture, And so, yeah, say a little bit about that in terms of this essay and what you wanted to highlight.
Right. I guess, I mean, Walid Daqqa also experienced solitary confinement as part, there's the story of him smuggling out his sperm to conceive his child, Milad. And one of the punishments sort of for this act of resistance was his own experience of solitary confinement. But also the essay traces another very prominent and infuriating story of ongoing solitary confinement, which is Ahmed Manasra, who was imprisoned as a child, accused of stabbing a settler, and has been left in solitary confinement for months on end, to the point where he has developed some forms of mutism, some would say also schizophrenia. And so part of this this experience of torture under imprisonment, which Daqqa is describing and diagnosing in his study, is to understand the function, like the strategic function that this type of torture plays. Knowing, of course, that like a sadism of this type of violence is also part of a strategic equation, but also a psychic position of Zionism, so that it doesn't necessarily exist sort of in this like exceptional outside place as like an unfortunate byproduct of a jailer who feels angry and wants to torture someone, but that actually the torture is strategically baked in to the experience of Zionist prisons, and that they intend to use torture as a way to produce a psychic death for Palestinians. And solitary confinement is one of the most extreme versions of that torture that takes many different shapes. And so Daqqa is basically looking, and others, many other Palestinian scholars who have written about this, like Laura and Stephen Sheehy, talk about the use of confinement and torture as a way to try to sever the psychic self from the collective social self, like to use very vulgar categories. And that same relationship is the countering sort of force to that the linkages between that same relationship include sumud, the steadfastness, and resistance itself as a type of as an assertion of psychological health. So this section basically traces those stories and tries to put Daqqa's contribution about torture into a larger conversation about torture across the Palestinian struggle. And this is very important, and we'll come back. We essentially come back to it later in the essay with the post-Al-Aqsa flood, where we've seen the essentially re-acceleration of mass torture, death camps and concentration camps outside of Gaza, where fighters and non-fighters alike are being subjected to some of the most extreme forms of torture. And one can basically understand this not just as a state of exception, even if the sort of state of exception is what is used to justify it discursively, but actually something that's fundamentally built into the Zionist project of colonization. And so, yeah, that it's essentially a lot of this section is legwork to help us to understand what happens after October 7th and how it relates to the prisoners.
Thank you. So another section about prisoners in the post-Oslo era. I'm just going to read a little bit of your writing here again, Kaleem. So, quote, they withhold their labor, refuse participation in show pony juridical processes. They do all this under unbearable conditions, their bodies consecrating a demand for Palestinians to be liberated from systems of domination and control. Ultimately, this enacts a reversal of liberal appeal to the jailer, to the courts, to the international community, offering instead one end to a political ellipsis. Uh, were the outside to take the prisoners into consideration on the basis of these desires, if the world were if the world were fully to answer them, the outcome might resemble a reckoning, end quote. And so, again, I just want to highlight how beautifully written this is, and thank you for that, Kaleem. And then bridge us. This helps to bring us to, I think, some discussion of Al-Aqsa flood as well, situating it firmly within the history of the prisoner struggles that you lay out in this essay. So, can you say a little bit more, both of you, about what it means to, take prisoners into consideration and to talk about Al-Aqsa flood as a continuity with the prison struggle and the anti-colonial resistance of Palestinians?
Yeah, I think this is a really important section to pause on, because essentially we spend the first sort of 2/3 of the essay describing how the Palestinian captives movement has taken up the struggle, some of the qualitative changes in that struggle. But then the essay suddenly pivots to October 7th and basically asks the question, what does the outside do about this reality? Its intention is to reframe Al-Aqsa flood as a prisoners' operation, and the resistance in Gaza as a movement for prisoners. And again, like, nothing that's being said here is particularly new intervention. It was in the original statements from the resistance on October 7th and onwards. If anyone had bothered to write about it appropriately, they would have seen that the one of the primary logics of October 7th was about the release of the prisoners. And I think most people writing in English haven't even attempted to suggest this, not because they're not aware, but because I think it undermines sort of this held affective position that many people have, that October 7th was unimaginable, unjustifiable. Even people who claim to be in solidarity with the struggle will say this, but you can read sort of more deeply into the words they choose and where they choose to focus, and it will tell you a lot. So the demands of the prisoners, so to speak, that the outside world would meet, or the desires of the prisoners actually, is not just release from prison, but also return. And return as sort of something that challenges the entire colonial project. These terms are unified, and one of the unifying phenomenon for Palestinians across all the areas of their life. But of course, they're really heightened for prisoners who are in this position of confinement and torture. And so why this is important is because it shows, basically, it creates October 7th creates a fracture along long existing fault lines within the national liberation struggle, between people who have a level of adherence to these values and political demands, and moreover are accountable to the prisoners, and those who are not, and who essentially claim misleadership. And for that latter group of people, many of whom within the Palestinian Authority, they will emphasize some of the discursive elements of the prisoner struggle. They will talk about the prisoners, they'll have prisoners posters, but as Daqqa says, what they are doing is they are replacing the struggle for return with the story of return, a utopian return. And so what October 7th shows is what one vision of what it would look like to adhere to the fundamental principle of fighting for the prisoner, for the betterment of their conditions, for their release, and putting that claim into force as part of your struggle. Why this is important is because it puts October 7th in. Yes, so October 7th is in some ways unprecedented, in some ways spectacular, using the sense of spectacle. But at the same time, it follows a very highly legible historical terrain. This is not the first attempt at prisoner exchanges, as the essay discusses. So the 1983 and 1985 prisoner exchanges, the Gilad Shalit exchanges for Gilad Shalit in 2011. And so In some ways, this is a response, I would say, to a piece that really stood out to me early on in the genocide by Adam Schatz. He wrote this frankly embarrassing essay called "Vengeful Pathologies" in the London Review of Books early on into the genocide, and he basically mutilates Fanon to suggest that Palestinian resistance is a type of barbarism. And he gets to claim sort of this even-handedness, which is the very comfortable position where you get to say, I condemn this, but I do understand it, right? Even if I do not approve. And basically, yeah, taking this act out of the realm of the strategic and historical into some sort of, again, a state of exception, rather than understanding prisoner exchanges as a long-standing military strategy to secure the dignity of the Palestinian people and to strengthen the struggle with the return of cadre who are able to lead that struggle, and also to meet the demands of the people, many of whom their lives are being torn apart by this colonial violence and imprisonment.
Yeah, and just to add on what Kaleem said, I think, to truly understand the significance of October 7th and how it relates to imprisonment, it's important for us to contextualize the Palestinian condition as one of imprisonment. We look at the siege on Gaza, which, Gaza has been under siege, blockaded by land, air, and sea for over 17 years. We look at the West Bank and the kind of policing and surveillance and arrests and imprisonment that the Palestinian population in the West Bank face. We look at the repression that we face in the diaspora and the increasing repression, the heightened surveillance that we're seeing, and we can understand the Palestinian condition as a condition of imprisonment in varied different forms. And as an extension of that, we also need to understand and contextualize prisoner exchanges, as Kaleem just spoke to. So, history has taught the Palestinian people that the liberation of prisoners is only possible through the tactic of prisoner exchange. Israel has refused, the Zionist entity of Israel have refused to respond to kind of global campaigns and international pressure to release our prisoners. We've seen multiple different organizations, including the PYM, take up campaigns to free Palestinian prisoners, and the Zionist regime continues to withhold prisoners and deny kind of basic, life-sustaining life-sustaining rights that kind of Kaleem just spoke to. And so in light of that, this moment has reaffirmed the use of prisoner exchanges as a legitimate and effective tactic within national liberation and anti-colonial struggles. And in the context of Palestine, Kaleem already mentioned a well-known historical example, which is the 1985 Jibril Agreement, in which 1,150 Palestinian and Lebanese prisoners were freed in exchange for 3 Israeli soldiers captured by the Palestinian resistance. And if you just think about that kind of ratio, 3 Israeli soldiers and 1,150 Palestinians, you can see the scale of what October 7th could have made possible. And of those released by Israel in the Jibril Agreement, of those 1,150, many of them would go on to become the backbone of the First Intifada. They became leaders in the resistance movement in the First Intifada. And you can see how, again, the condition of imprisonment is used to separate our leaders, but also create it like almost by accident, creates our leaders. And our leaders are, a lot of leaders from the First Intifada were those that were released in the 1985 Jibril Agreement. And so for Palestinians, the focus on prisoners and on prisoner exchanges, as Kaleem mentioned, even though this moment is a watershed moment, it's a historical moment in our national liberation struggle, it's also in a lot of ways not a surprise, and it's nothing new, because we've always known the centrality of prisoners and the use of prisoner exchanges as a legitimate anti-colonial tool and tactic, and it's part of the legacy of our struggle and kind of a necessary juncture on the path to liberation.
Yeah, and this terrain that this like well understood terrain, as in the Israelis deeply understand it, it's ingrained in their history, is very valuable for not being distracted by a lot of the excuses that we are currently hearing about during the ongoing ceasefire negotiations. Essentially, the way they're being framed as this never-ending negotiation process to conceal what is actually happening and why, and what the Zionist regime is actually trying to achieve in Gaza and in Palestine. Because if, in fact, what they were primarily interested in was the release of the prisoners, then the way to do it is well known to everyone. And the resistance offered to release those prisoners on October 8th. And so the framework for doing so and the demands for doing so were very simple and unequivocally just, which was to release the thousands of Palestinian prisoners, many of whom have been arrested as children and never charged, and to end the siege of 2 million people who have been starved and targeted from the air for years. Those essentially that the Israeli regime and its Western backers can't bring themselves to acquiesce to those demands has more to say about them than it does anything else, because it would essentially mean that they would have to take their sort of pent up frustration and shame at their total military and strategic defeat that they're currently externalizing and taking out predominantly on a population that is unable to defend itself, and it would have to turn inwards. And Daqqa writes about this in another one of his essays, Control and Time, where he describes the act of, what's the quote? The act of looking into the prisoner's mirror and seeing one's own hideous self. Speaking of the jailer, the experience of the jailer. And so I think, I think this is like a good reminder of what October 7th was. Obviously, there's many other elements to this experience of ongoing genocide and the horror of the last 11 months, the more than 200,000 people who have been killed and maimed and imprisoned. And so it's important not to lose sight of it as part of the larger conversation about what's been happening.
Yeah, thank you. Another thing you highlight in the piece, that I wanted to raise up is you caution about the way that Palestinians are often depicted as victims, right? And we're all very used to this. It's, these are images that are ingrained in our minds over the last 11 months, through social media. And how much faster and farther the images of genocidal acts and terror spread than the acts of heroic resistance. And, I've encountered this even among like friends of mine who are pro-Palestinian, right? Go to protests, like, um, have often felt the need to leave social media. And I'm not, please get away from social media. Like, I'm not telling people not to leave social media, but just because of sort of the mental health of, experiencing these images and the way that it was drawing them down and kind of the amount of carnage and violence. And, when I brought up the fact that, like, there are also images of resistance, there's images of people blowing up tanks with, setting, bomb or grenades basically like right on them and this kind of thing. Like, they weren't actually even aware that such a thing was going on, essentially, and you can understand that if they're only consuming certain, accounts and your social media feed looks a certain way, and also if you just consume news in this country on any, even something like Democracy Now all the way to like mainstream media, you probably wouldn't see any of the resistance activity. And so I don't know specifically if that's the kind of point that you were trying to make, but I would love if you just talk a little bit about that aspect.
Right. So I think just to be precise about this, like the images of violence done to Palestinians in Gaza are a fundamental part of the experience of this genocide. They're no less real or true, one could say, than the images of the resistance, and also many of those images of resistance are produced as a type of propaganda, right? They're filmed by fighters, and then they're used to make essentially to cause a crisis within Israeli society, to assist the resistance with particular objectives, to project an image of strength. And so this is like I guess it's a really complicated issue, but like I think this idea of like the images of victimhood has less to do with the experience of violence, which, as I say, is real and almost totalizing over Palestinian history and over these last 11 months, but more to critique the way those images are circulated and consumed in the West, and like why they strike a chord with people, and the different ways that can be problematized. So again, like with the acknowledgement that this is a really complicated issue, like I think in some ways images of this experience of violence are like they can be open casket funerals. They in some cases they are invitations for people to bear witness. In other cases, they're images extracted by international news media and circulated for Western consumption. This is one example, but that's less now, because many of those media people those journalists are out of harm's way if they held a foreign passport. And so what you have right now is this sort of hurricane of different images, sometimes produced by families themselves, sometimes not, and images of suffering and attempts at advocacy. I think the only thing we can really comment on is the terms of our reception and what we do with that here. And you're talking about sort of this anxiety or overwhelming response that people have, and I similarly won't judge any person from especially Palestinians and Arabs from taking a break from it. But I think there's an element of this which is of people being unsettled by the images, because it is undermining their belief in like the ability to redeem the Western project. And this is most common with liberal Zionists, the types of people who want to insist that this is all Netanyahu's fault, or the people want to insist this is all Biden or Kamala Harris's fault. Because if you concentrate on a specific individual and individualize the blame, you can still maintain your sort of the coherence of your worldview. And so for that reason, I think it's really important to remind ourselves that every Israeli supports the genocide, that it's essentially, that it's fundamentally a sick society that is reproducing this violence onto generations that come. And not only every Israeli, but that the majority of Jewish institutions in the United States, the big institutions of religious and political life in America, support the ongoing genocide. People don't necessarily want to be confronted with that reality, that these institutions are basically taking youth and providing essentially an indoctrination into a racist ideology. And some of those youth will go fight an occupied people and shoot or bomb or torture them. And so these images are a site of confrontation for the reality of these social relations. But what the piece is trying to do, like why it's trying to intervene here, I think, is because just the images of suffering or the experience of violence, the body or the mind can metabolize this in some cases. Like if you've convinced yourself that Palestinians deserve this, then you can very easily process these overwhelming images. You can even subconsciously come to enjoy it because you want to punish the Palestinians for having made you feel fear for the first time in a while. And so I think a lot of the like intellectual, like a lot of the writing in this moment has this anxiety in it. And I think the Schatz piece has this anxiety in it really significantly. They're concerned with the return to normal. How do we get back to normal? Some people who say they're in solidarity with us, really what they're saying is, okay, that's enough punishment. They've learned their place. Let us go back to that normal, which is, you know, that normal that is essentially slow death. And so I think part of what these counter images do is provide an avenue for understanding what a non-normal might look like. And for some people that's scary, and for others that is empowering. It's obviously really complicated, but it is the case that these types of images are erased from our analysis of this moment and from an analysis of the spectacle. And I cite a couple of different thinkers who've done this, and the reason that they're being effaced is because of what it means for the possibilities, like what Palestinian resistance might ultimately mean for the changing relations of property and land. And so I guess why I spend so much time in the essay sort of describing the videos of the prisoners that were released in November. So for context for people, in November, there were the first set of prisoner exchanges after Al-Aqsa flood. And you had the majority of women and children, Palestinian women and children in Zionist prisons released as part of those exchanges. And this is, you know, completely erased from most of the discourses on the left about this moment. But we have videos of the prisoners being released and in some cases rushing into their families' hands or being greeted, etc. And, you know, people have written thousands and thousands of words analyzing the image in this moment and what it means about Gaza, and like almost none have talked about this set of images. And there's, essentially there's a reason for that, and I think it's it shows that there is kind of an elimination that's at play, where people do not want to take seriously the struggle on its own terms. And I think you know, those images are just one set of a larger picture that we need to keep in mind when we think about the last 11 months.
Yeah. I also think it's important for us to also kind of historicize like where this victim narrative comes from. And it, you know, like as Kaleem said, it is, you know, a complex thing for us to be discussing. But I think it is important to note that a lot of the victim narrative that we see today kind of is a product of the capitulation of the signing of the Oslo Accords. And, you know, when the Oslo Accords were signed, we saw the Palestinian national liberation struggle kind of being transformed from a national liberation struggle into a state building project by the Palestinian Authority. And, you know, we saw increased NGOization and neoliberalization, and we saw, you know, all these Western NGOs and Western kind of foreign and development funding kind of flood into Palestine and specifically into the West Bank and Gaza. And so I think there's also like a narrative intervention there, or like an intervention to be made about, you know, where does this victim narrative come from? Like how can we pinpoint it in and historicize it into a particular moment in history? And how can we reframe the way we think about, you know, things like aid, for example, into a more holistic understanding. So like in the Palestinian Youth Movement, for example, we talk about this concept of ta'ziz as-sumud, which is a Palestinian concept. Sumud means steadfastness, and ta'ziz means kind of making it easier. So making it easier for our people to practice steadfastness. And how can the way that we understand supporting our people in Gaza be supporting their steadfastness, and how that can kind of reframe our understanding of aid, and kind of humanitarianism. And this isn't a new concept. You know, we look to history. We look at the Black Panther Party and their survival programs, like the schools breakfast programs, and this idea of survival pending revolution, and how can we reframe our understanding of the support that we need to give to our people back home, not as giving them support because they are agentless victims that need to be kind of like saved by human rights defenders and mental health practitioners and all of these sorts of things, but as, political agents who, through, our fundraising efforts in the diaspora, we can rebuild Gaza and support the steadfastness of our people. So I think there's like an important intervention, like a narrative intervention to make there as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. I totally agree. We talked about something kind of similar with Abdul Jawad Omar at one point, and I think the way that you just laid it out, like, really kind of crystallizes it for me. So you also caution. Oh, sorry, I'm just rereading the thing. So there are some important themes towards the close of the essay that we wanted to touch on. Both, so maybe we do these in two parts, kind of, but there's a reflection on time, right? Which I think you referenced earlier, Kaleem, from Dhaka, um, but also the ease at which, especially at a distance, those who want to be in solidarity imagine ourselves in some way as part of a Palestinian struggle. In this, sorry, those who imagine ourselves, right, as wanting to be a part of the Palestinian struggle or as being a part of it, that we can turn the prisoner into a fetish object. And both of these points I wanted to make sure we took some time to touch on, because I think that they're, for anyone who's done prisoner solidarity work, knows that this is an issue that folks run into, regarding the kind of idea of fetishizing a prisoner as this object. But I also did want to make some time for these reflections on time, and so we can divide that up however you want, but I want to touch on those points.
Okay, maybe I can talk about the second one a little bit. Yeah, about like the ways that we fail our prisoners. Again, I think it's complicated, but one essay that I was thinking about when writing this section was essay by Faisal Darraj, who's a Palestinian intellectual from Syria, and he has an essay called "Where Did the Martyrs Go?" In 1996, and I think like putting his words side by side with Daqqa's, one is about one more about prisoners, one about martyrs, can help to answer this question. Both of them talk about, I guess, like the failures of language, or like the hollowness of words if they're not connected to a practice of struggle. So Darraj writes that rhetoric can summon words and they respond obediently, but something lies behind the walls of the rhetorical flourishes, end quote. And Daqqa calls this essentially the wasted speech of the outside world. So both of them are saying that if you think about the prisoner or the martyr as sort of necessary for the circulation of an idea, this is something that's said a lot, but the martyr or prisoner themselves is relegated to anonymity, excluded from meaning making, or else like turned into this sort of static image that is brought out at protests or commemorations, that this is ultimately hollow. It's extractive, and like, what are you doing about it is the question that Sanat is asking in some of her in her writings after Daqqa's martyrdom. She's saying that most of the outside world failed him, and that no one should have to die in prison when there are millions of their compatriots, and she's addressing this in some ways to the Arab world specifically, millions of your compatriots around you who are not doing anything about it. So I don't have an answer, and I would be curious for the people that do prisoner solidarity work in the US, what their thoughts are. But to me, one way to honor that story, let's say, or like to honor the prisoners and martyrs, is through struggle, and to also insist on taking them out of a this like production line of focused stories that are focused on their final operation if they're martyred, or their exploits in prison, and to try and be a little bit more curious about their lives and their histories, and the stories of those prisoners. And I think one example that I was thinking about a lot before the piece came out in August, before this interview, is that some of the prisoners that were released in the November exchanges have gone on to be rearrested. Rauda is brought up as one example in the essay, but also last week, Dania Hanashe, who is a Birzeit University student released in the November exchanges, was rearrested in Ramallah. And this is something the Israelis do often. There's many people, former prisoners from the 2011 prisoner exchanges were rearrested too, like Hanan Barghouti. So this idea of like the struggle is ongoing, not to romanticize the acts of resistance or the releases specifically, and to also to be let's say clear-eyed about the fact that this struggle has martyrs, and that has reverberating social consequences. So we learned that 3 of the prisoners that were released in the November releases again were martyred this last week in Tulkarem. Tariq Dawood and Jibril and Wa'el Masha are now recent martyrs. And so some people continue on with the struggle after they are released from prison, others do not. The way to sort of honor that experience is to be engaged, to have specificity, and also to be engaged in a process of struggle where you live and work as well.
Yeah. I think to build on what Kaleem said, it's important to be grounded in, why prisoners are the compass of our struggle. We've talked about this a few times throughout the show, but I think it's important for us to dig deeper into that kind of into that saying, I guess, so that it doesn't become an empty slogan, and to actually understand kind of the weight behind saying something like prisoners are the compass of our struggle. And to answer that question, we can think about a few things. We can think about who is imprisoned. We've already spoken about this. It's our leaders and resistance fighters. Why they're imprisoned, and they're imprisoned for daring to resist. When are they imprisoned? Which again, we've already spoken about. There's a rise of imprisonment and policing and incarceration during moments of heightened confrontation with the enemy, but also kind of what the prison means in Palestine, which has kind of a very particular and specific meaning that I think we've touched on kind of throughout this episode. Palestinian prisoners continue to organize from within the walls of prison. Our prisoners produce theory, and they produce analysis, and they produce literature, and the prisoners movement is a site of production of knowledge. Prisoners have developed entire curricula for helping kind of young prisoners complete, their high school education, university degrees. And Palestinian prison literature is a genre in its own right. We look at Walid Daqqa as one example of this, who from behind bars, as a novelist and a political analyst with huge kind of he's renowned in the Palestinian community and in our struggle. And Wissam Rafidi is another example of this, who wrote the Trinity Fundamentals, which the PYM recently translated, and he wrote that from within the walls of Zionist prison. And so the Palestinian prisoners movement turn prisons into sites of organizing, into sites of knowledge production, that enable Palestinian prisoners to continue contributing to our struggle and driving our struggle forward from within prison. And, even when the tools of resistance for prisoners are few, Palestinian prisoners use, as prisoners in other liberation struggles throughout history, use their bodies as tools of resistance, through hunger strikes. And so, when weapons of resistance are few, the prisoners remind us that our bodies can also be a front. And so there's particularities and differences and really important things for us to remember that the Palestinian prisoner struggle teaches us. In the West, a lot of the time, kind of the prison is seen as the end, as a way of containing people. But actually, Palestinian prisoners refuse this. They resist against it, and they insist, and they continue to produce knowledge and organize, and continue to fight to be political agents, even within the walls of prison. And while they're political agents in their own right, they're also resisting as part of a collective liberation struggle and refusing their isolation from the broader Palestinian liberation movement. And so there's this there's all these lessons that we have to learn. We spoke about unity. We spoke about, being creative in your tools of resistance. We talked about not allowing, the tools of the enemy to suppress us from being able to contribute to our national liberation struggle. And so all of these lessons that we can learn from the Palestinian prisoners movement, these are some of the ways that we can honor Palestinian prisoners and kind of not allow their sacrifices to be in vain, and to not kind of take for granted the sacrifices that they make, and to really truly kind of embody what it means when we say prisoners are the compass of our struggle.
Thank you. I love that. So I realized as we were talking through this that there's a figure in the essay that we really didn't touch on that we should, which is Yahya Sinwar. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how he figures into this piece, both from obviously the town that we mentioned up at the front to October 7th as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for those who don't know, Yahya Sinwar is the head of Hamas in Gaza. In the section on October 7th, it discusses the fact that Sinwar's family is from Al-Majdal, which opens the essay. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who is also one of the founders of Hamas, is also from Al-Majdal. So you're sort of coming into this circuitry, I guess, of dispossession and resistance, and understanding it in its geographic sort of particularity. Both of these men are themselves prisoners, former prisoners, released in prisoner exchanges. Yassin was released in the 83-85 period that Jeanine mentioned, Jibril agreement swaps, and Yahya Sinwar was released in as part of the 2011 swap. And so basically you it's I don't want to like belabor the point, but I get and with Palestine, you know, everyone is from somewhere, and there's these stories are, you know, ubiquitous everywhere. You find stories of dispossession, and then sort of forks in the road and how people have taken them up or not. But it is, I thought it was an interesting sort of connective tissue, that these men would be displaced, and their families or their families would be displaced from Al-Majdal, where Walid Daqqa decades later would find himself imprisoned. And the acts of the prisoner and the resistance figure, you know, are not in isolation, but their acts, individual acts within and across this small strip of land in the south of Palestine produce reverberations for all the prisoners and all the people in Gaza. That's really the extent of the analysis there, but it is also a way, again, to respond to some of the most some of the strategies that are used in Western media to mystify Palestinian resistance. You know, the New Yorker magazine, the editor of that magazine, David Remnick, recently wrote a very long profile on Yahya Sinwar. And like Schatz, its primary attempt is to depict this man as barbaric, a sadist, and in so doing cast the project of Palestinian resistance, again, both armed and not, as operating under the same logics to basically, as we said, the liberal shorthand of focusing on the individual to avoid looking at the structure. And it's really this essay is a masterclass in doing what the New Yorker has done best in this genocide. And I'll remind people that David Remnick was a loud supporter of the Iraq War and is essentially doing the same thing to create, to manufacture consent for genocide in Palestine. And the only way I think we get to a place that moves past conditional solidarity is understanding the historic conditions that produce Palestinian resistance, and you know the logics of it, how it figures into the struggle, so that we will not be caught in these loops or cycles of paralysis. And the media is very intent on making sure we are making sure that we are stuck there. And you know, this is one way we can make sure we're informed, so that you know, it doesn't stop us from doing the work we need to be doing in this moment.
Yeah, thank you. It struck me too, just thinking on the language of the piece too, that you know, that quote from earlier, "We're the outside to take prisoners into consideration on the basis of those desires." You know, that certainly someone like Yahya Sinwar would understand those desires, right? Would have experienced those desires as well, right? And so thinking about that in terms of the connection to also, you know, an operation to liberate the prisoners, you know. So anyway, I just want to thank you both for taking the time to have this discussion with us today. It's been wonderful, and I want to give you just a minute if there's anything in closing that you want to, you know, share or offer. It's been great to be in dialogue with you both today. Things to reflect on as we wrap up. Yeah, I think just I think it's really like we don't take for granted anyone's time or attention. So it's, if you're still here and you've spent time engaging with Walid Daqqa's work and life, and know more than, you know, just his name, but what he stood for and what he wrote and the people in his life that were important to him, then that is, then yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, and I guess just to kind of keep up the fight, you know, as we mentioned in the beginning, we're coming up to a year of genocide, And, you know, it's really important in these moments to remember that we're in a protracted struggle, that there are, you know, waves of, you know, upsurges, and waves of consolidation. And it's in the moments of consolidation we're able to build kind of the muscle necessary to be able to continue this fight until liberation. And so, yeah, even though I think a lot of people, I'm feeling like there's starting to seep into people's yeah, there's kind of a feeling of cynicism and defeatism that's starting to seep into a lot of people that are organizing for Palestine. But just to remember that, you know, yeah, this is a protracted struggle, and ultimately, we are, you know, yeah, moving closer and closer to liberation, with every day that passes. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. To that end, if anybody tomorrow we'll have Dr. Lara Shihai, and she's always great at I think, helping us get our heads back in the fight. And so anyone that's experiencing that as well, I recommend also that people tune into that discussion tomorrow with her, to ground and recenter, and you know get ourselves in a good headspace to struggle forward. So again, like, thank you so much, both of you, for your work, for your writing, and for your time today for this conversation. It's been, great to be with you.
Thank you, Jared.
Thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Thanks.